I still remember that Tuesday afternoon when my phone lit up with Richard's name. Richard Kessler, a name I hadn't seen flash across my screen in what felt like ages. My fingers hesitated before swiping right. After all, CEOs don't just call former executives for casual catch-ups, do they? Clara! It's been too long. His voice boomed through the speaker with that familiar rehearsed warmth. Listen, I've been meaning to get together. How about lunch this Friday? There's this fantastic new place downtown. Very exclusive, very you. Very me? I hadn't spoken to Richard in over 18 months. What could he possibly know about what was very me these days? You see, I was employee number 1 at Nexora Insights. When Marcus, the founder, first pitched his vision to me in that dingy coffee shop 20 years ago, Nexora wasn't a $120 million powerhouse. It was just a wild idea scribbled on cafe napkins. I believed in that vision enough to leave my secure corporate job. Together, we built something extraordinary from nothing. After Marcus stepped away to pursue his next adventure, the company evolved. New leadership came in, Richard among them. Gradually, I found myself consulted less and less on major decisions, despite having helped architect the company's foundation. My voice, once essential to Nexora's direction, became increasingly peripheral. So when Richard's lunch invitation arrived out of the blue, that old instinct, the same one that had guided me through countless business challenges, started whispering, warnings. This wasn't about reconnecting. Something was brewing, and whatever it was, Richard wanted to deliver the news in person. I've been meaning to catch up too, I lied smoothly. Friday works perfectly. As I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that this lunch would mark the beginning of something significant. What I didn't realize was just how right that instinct would prove to be. Not just for me, but for the future of Nexora itself. Friday arrived with unseasonable warmth, much like Richard's overly enthusiastic greeting when I stepped into Lumina, downtown's newest temple to minimalist dining. The restaurant screamed statement. All sleek angles, exposed concrete, and artful lighting that somehow made everyone look simultaneously flattered and slightly uncomfortable. Clara. There you are. Richard rose from his seat, arms outstretched, as if we were old friends reuniting. I accepted his embrace with practiced ease, noting the unfamiliar young woman seated beside him who didn't bother to stand. This is Savannah, Richard announced with unmistakable pride, gesturing toward her. My daughter. Daughter? I knew Richard had children, of course, but the last I'd heard, Savannah was finishing her undergraduate degree. The woman before me, with her immaculate blazer and calculating gaze, was clearly well beyond college years. Savannah just completed her MBA at Wharton, Richard continued, confirming my suspicions. Top of her class. Impressive, I offered, extending my hand. Wonderful to meet you. Her handshake was brief. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. The pleasure's all mine. I've heard so much about you, Clara. The waiter appeared, pouring water into crystal glasses that probably cost more than my first month's salary at Nexora. Richard ordered a bottle of champagne without consulting either of us. We're celebrating, he explained, answering my unasked question. By the time our first course arrived, something deconstructed involving foam that I couldn't quite identify, Richard finally got to the point. Clara, you've been instrumental to Nexora's success. That's why I wanted to tell you this news in person. He paused, swirling his champagne. We're restructuring the executive team to bring fresh perspectives. Savannah will be taking over your division. We're giving you a generous 45-day transition period. The words hung in the air like suspended particles. I didn't immediately respond, choosing instead to take a measured sip of my champagne. Dad believes the company needs innovation, Savannah chimed in, her voice silky with confidence. Sometimes, you need to update the antiques to stay competitive. I nearly choked on my drink. Did she just call me an antique? Richard laughed nervously. What Savannah means is that fresh eyes can sometimes see opportunities that more experienced executives might miss. I set my glass down carefully, ensuring my expression revealed nothing of the calculations already running through my mind. Absolutely, I agreed pleasantly. Fresh perspectives are valuable. I'm curious, Savannah. What's your experience with data analytics architecture or enterprise-level security protocols? Her momentary hesitation told me everything I needed to know. I'll be bringing contemporary management approaches that transcend those technical details. She recovered smoothly. I smiled. Fascinating approach. Well then, I look forward to making this transition as smooth as possible. As we finished lunch, with forced pleasantries, neither Richard nor his wunderkind daughter suspected what I knew. They had just awakened a sleeping giant. Not out of malice or revenge, but because they'd forgotten something fundamental about Nexora's early days, something written into contracts signed when the company was still struggling to find its footing. My 6% stake in preferred equity, with voting rights, and veto power. Sometimes the most powerful pieces on the board are the ones opponents forget are still in play. The moment I returned home from that lunch, I headed straight for my home office. In the back of my closet sat a fireproof safe, old school. Security for old school documents. I spun the dial with practiced fingers and pulled out a leather portfolio that hadn't seen daylight in years. Inside lay Nexora's original incorporation papers, shareholder agreements, and amendments. Papers signed when we were still working out of Marcus's garage, when we celebrated landing a $50,000 client as if we'd won the lottery. My fingers traced over Marcus's signature, bold and optimistic, just like he was. He had insisted on this particular clause, even when our first angel investor balked. Clara isn't just an employee, he had said. She's the backbone. Without her, there is no Nexora. That backbone came with 6% preferred equity with specific protections. As the company grew and subsequent funding rounds diluted everyone's shares, Marcus ensured my stake retained its teeth, voting rights disproportionate to the percentage, owned, and veto power over major organizational changes. I'd never wielded this power. Not when Marcus stepped down. Not when the board brought in Richard. Not when they shifted our core business model away from what I believed was our strength. I'd been the quiet professional, the trusted advisor who stepped back when asked. Perhaps that's why they'd forgotten these papers existed at all. Or perhaps they simply assumed I'd forgotten. The following morning, I called Jerome Patterson, a corporate attorney who'd been with us since the early days, but now ran his own practice. "Clara, this is unexpected," he answered, genuine warmth in his voice. "Please tell me you're finally starting that competitive venture we talked about years ago." I laughed. "Not quite, Jerome. I need your eyes on some old documents. How's your schedule today?" 3 hours later, we sat in his office, papers spread across his mahogany desk. "These are absolutely still valid," Jerome confirmed, adjusting his reading glasses. The series of funding rounds and restructuring never invalidated these specific protections. In fact, the language here is surprisingly robust. He looked up at me. "Clara, you have significant power here, the kind that could stop a restructuring in its tracks if you chose to exercise it." I nodded slowly. "And what about the IP ownership structure from 2010? The core algorithms?" Jerome flipped through another document. "That's even more interesting. The patents were filed with you as co-inventor. While Nexora holds the rights, there are usage restrictions if specific personnel, meaning you, are removed from oversight positions." He whistled softly. "Someone was really looking out for you." "Marcus understood my value," I said simply. "So what's prompting this review?" Jerome asked, leaning back in his chair. I assume not mere curiosity. I told him about the lunch, about Savannah, about being called an antique. Jerome winced. "Ouch, so what's your plan?" "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "But I do know this. I won't stand by and watch 20 years of my work dismantled by someone who thinks enterprise analytics is a series of videos." "Well," Jerome said, gathering the documents carefully. Whatever you decide, you're negotiating from a position of strength. Just remember, timing matters as much as the power itself. As I left his office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the quiet confidence that comes with holding cards others don't know exist. Not for revenge, not for power, but for protection of what I'd helped build. The question wasn't if I would use this leverage, but when and how. Over the next 2 weeks, I moved with deliberate care, like a chess player setting up pieces several moves before they're needed. Each morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, 7:15 a.m., when only the security guards and the most ambitious junior analysts were present. These quiet hours proved invaluable. I meticulously copied relevant documents, logged access to systems I'd need later, and cataloged intellectual property I'd helped develop. This wasn't corporate espionage. Everything I accessed was within my current clearance level. I was simply creating a comprehensive library of my contributions and legal standing. I also began reconnecting with key team members, not by undermining Savannah or Richard, but through genuine outreach. Andre from product development and Letitia from client relations had been with Nexora almost as long as I had. Both were brilliant, loyal, and, most importantly, clear-eyed about the company's strengths and weaknesses. "Coffee?" I texted Andre on Wednesday morning. Within an hour, we were seated in the corner of a cafe 3 blocks from the office. "This isn't just a social call, is it?" Andre asked, cutting straight to the point as always. I smiled. "Can't it be both? I've missed our conversations. Clara, we've worked together for 15 years. I know your something's brewing face." He leaned forward. "What's happening?" I kept my tone casual. "Have you met Richard's daughter Savannah yet?" Andre's expression shifted subtly. "Briefly. She toured the product floor yesterday. Asked some interesting questions." "Interesting how?" "Let's just say she seemed to fundamentally misunderstand what our core analytics suite actually does." He stirred his coffee. "She suggested we might pivot to a more video-friendly interface." I nearly spat out my latte. "For enterprise-level data processing?" Her exact words. Andre's eyes narrowed. "Clara, what's really going on?" "Savannah's taking over my division. 45-day transition." Andre set down his cup with more force than necessary. I don't even have words." "I do," I replied calmly. "But most of them aren't suitable for public spaces." "What are you going to do? For now, observe, document, prepare." I met his gaze directly. "And I'd appreciate if you'd do the same. Not to undermine anyone, just to keep detailed notes on decisions, directions, client reactions." Andre nodded slowly. "You know I've got your back. Always have." Later that afternoon, Letitia and I took a walking meeting through the park next to our building. Her insights proved even more valuable. 2 of our biggest clients already caught wind of changes coming, she revealed. Meridian Systems called yesterday asking point blank if you were leaving. What did you tell them? The truth, that I didn't. No. She glanced at me. Should I have said something else? No, I assured her. Transparency is best right now. What was their reaction? Let's just say their procurement officer mentioned that their contract renewal next quarter would be contingent on continuity of service quality. I stored this information carefully. Client confidence was Nexora's lifeblood. Any threat to that confidence could sway the board more effectively than internal politics ever could. That evening, I made one more crucial call to Marcus himself. He'd stepped away from daily operations years ago, but maintained a small equity stake in emeritus board position. They're doing what? He asked after I explained the situation. His laugh held more disbelief than humor. Richard's putting his daughter in your role? The same daughter who was in high school when we were debugging the Westlake crisis? The very one, I confirmed. Fresh from Wharton, with apparently all the answers we've been missing. And you're calling to just inform you, I said carefully, as a courtesy between old friends. There was a knowing pause. Clara, you never make courtesy calls. What do you really need? Your memory, I admitted. Do you recall who else might have copies of the original shareholder agreements? Specifically the clauses regarding my equity position? Ah, Marcus said, understanding dawning in his voice. Playing the long game, I see. Check with Abigail in legal. She keeps everything. Probably still has hard copies tucked away somewhere. And Clara? Yes? Whatever you're planning, make it clean, surgical. The company deserves that much. As I hung up, I realized I had all the pieces I needed. The documentation was secure. Key allies were aware and watching. I had confirmation of my legal standing. Now came the hardest part, patience. I needed to give Savannah enough rope to reveal her limitations without damaging what we'd built. A delicate balance, but one I was uniquely qualified to manage. After all, I had helped build Nexora from nothing. I could certainly help save it from itself. The unraveling began faster than even I had anticipated. Within a week of our lunch, Savannah started making her presence felt throughout the company, scheduling back-to-back meetings with department heads and key clients. Her calendar, visible to all executives, showed 15-minute blocks stacked from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m., barely enough time to exchange pleasantries, let alone gain meaningful understanding of complex systems. I watched from the periphery, maintaining a helpful demeanor whenever she sought information, which wasn't often. Her philosophy quickly became clear. Nexora needed a complete reinvention to stay relevant. The first major misstep came during her call with Westerland Financial, our second largest client. I wasn't in the meeting, but Andre texted me afterward. Emergency damage control needed. She just told WF their customized security protocol was outdated thinking and could be replaced by standard cloud solutions. Anyone who'd spent more than a day in our industry would know that Westerland operated under strict regulatory frameworks that required their specific approach. By afternoon, their CTO had called Richard directly, demanding clarification. Clara. Richard's voice sounded strained when he caught me in the hallway later that day. Would you mind sitting in on the follow-up call with Westerland tomorrow, just as a resource person? Of course, I replied evenly. Happy to help with the transition. The follow-up call was painful to witness. Savannah attempted to backtrack while simultaneously doubling down on her innovative vision. I finally intervened when I saw the Westerland team exchanging alarmed glances. If I may, I interjected smoothly. What Savannah is suggesting could be implemented as an optional secondary layer while maintaining your current protocols. We've actually been developing something along those lines in R&D. We hadn't been, of course, but the promise of evolution rather than revolution calmed the waters. After the call, Savannah cornered me in the conference room. I had that under control, she hissed, color high in her cheeks. Of course, I agreed mildly. I was simply offering context. Context? She laughed sharply. What I need is forward thinking, not historical context. That's the problem with this place. Too much, looking backward. I merely nodded but made a mental note of the exchange. Her frustration was revealing itself earlier than expected. By the end of week 2, 3 more concerning developments had occurred. First, Savannah implemented an immediate hiring freeze across all departments, despite active searches for critical roles in cybersecurity and data architecture. Second, she presented a new organizational chart to Richard that eliminated 4 senior positions, all held by people who had questioned her approach in meetings. Finally, and most alarmingly, she began pushing for an accelerated migration to a new platform architecture that would effectively render much of our proprietary technology obsolete. When Letitia brought this last bit of news to me over yet another walking meeting, I knew the time for merely observing had passed. She scheduled a full platform review for Friday, Letitia reported. The vendor she's bringing in is TechVantage. I stopped walking. TechVantage? They're our direct competitor in 3 markets. Exactly. She's calling it a potential strategic partnership. That evening, I reviewed the documents Jerome had verified. My equity provisions included specific language about intellectual property protection and competitive exposure. This platform review could potentially trigger those protections. I called Jerome. How quickly can you prepare for a board intervention? Define intervention, he replied cautiously. I need to exercise certain rights before irreparable decisions are made. Jerome was silent for a moment. The quarterly board meeting is next Thursday. Technically, you could request an emergency session before then, but that would escalate things quickly. I considered this. Let's prepare for Thursday. That gives Savannah 1 more week to demonstrate her approach. And if she does something drastic before then we accelerate, I said simply. But I prefer to give her every opportunity to correct course on her own. Jerome sighed. Clara, I've known you long enough to recognize when you're being strategic versus when you're being kind. This is both, isn't it? I smiled despite myself. The best solutions usually are. What Jerome understood, and what Richard and Savannah didn't, was that this wasn't about preserving my role or wounded pride. This was about protecting 20 years of innovation, client relationships, and the livelihoods of hundreds of employees from hasty, uninformed decisions. The unraveling continued throughout the week. 2 senior developers resigned after contentious meetings with Savannah. A major client placed their contract review on hold pending clarification of service continuity. The atmosphere in the office grew increasingly tense. By Wednesday evening, I had a complete dossier prepared. Client concerns, staff departures, problematic decisions, and potential legal exposures, all documented with clinical precision. Not a weapon, but a mirror reflecting the reality of Savannah's brief tenure. As I prepared for Thursday's board meeting, I felt no satisfaction, only resolve. Sometimes protecting what you've built requires standing your ground, not out of ego, but out of responsibility to something larger than yourself. The stage was set. The next move would happen in the boardroom. Thursday morning arrived with that peculiar calm that often precedes significant confrontations. I dressed with particular care. A charcoal gray suit that projected authority without aggression, minimal, jewelry, hair pulled back neatly. The details mattered today. The boardroom at Nexora occupied the entire northeast corner of our building's top floor, a space designed to impress with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering panoramic city views. When I arrived 15 minutes early, only Diane, our corporate secretary, was present, arranging leather portfolios at each seat. "Good morning, Clara," she greeted me warmly. "It's been a while since we've seen you in these meetings." "Indeed," I replied, selecting a seat that would allow me to observe everyone's expressions. Though I never turned down an invitation. She gave me a knowing look. "Of course not. Coffee?" By 9 a.m., the room had filled with familiar faces, board members who had governed Nexora through its growth phases, most of whom I had known for years. Richard entered last, Savannah surprisingly at his side despite this being a closed board meeting. "Good morning, everyone," Richard began with his characteristic confidence. "Before we begin the formal agenda, I'd like to introduce my daughter Savannah, who will be observing today's proceedings as part of her executive transition." Several board members exchanged glances. This was highly irregular, allowing a non-board member to sit in on confidential discussions without prior notice or approval. Marcus, attending virtually from his lake house in Michigan, spoke first. "Richard, while I'm sure we're all delighted to meet Savannah, I believe there's a procedural question here. Observer status typically requires board approval." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Given that Savannah will be heading Clara's division effective next month, I thought this would be a valuable learning opportunity. But if there are objections, I move to allow it," said Philip Baxter, Richard's longtime ally on the board. For today's meeting only, as a professional courtesy. A quick vote followed, passing narrowly. I remained silent, making brief eye contact with Marcus on the video screen. His slight nod told me he understood what was coming. The meeting proceeded through standard updates, quarterly financials, market position reports, operational metrics. When the agenda turned to executive transition planning, Richard straightened in his chair. As most of you know, we're implementing some strategic leadership changes. Clara has graciously agreed to transition her responsibilities to Savannah over the next few weeks. He gestured to me. Clara, would you like to share any thoughts on the handover process? This was my opening. I placed my hands flat on the table and spoke clearly. Actually, Richard, I'd like to address a more fundamental matter before discussing any transition. I nodded to Diane, who distributed folders I had prepared. These documents require the board's immediate attention. Richard frowned. This isn't on our agenda, Clara. It falls under fiduciary responsibility, which is always on the agenda, I countered smoothly. These materials outline several concerning developments that have occurred in recent weeks, including potential breaches of shareholder agreements and intellectual property protections. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Boardy. Members began opening the folders, scanning the contents with growing concern. Additionally, I continued, I should remind the board of my standing as a preferred equity shareholder with specific voting rights and veto powers regarding organizational restructuring. I placed a copy of the original agreement on the table. This document, which Jerome Patterson has verified remains in full force, grants me authority to challenge decisions that fundamentally alter Nexora's operational integrity or intellectual assets. Richard's face darkened. This is highly irregular. Clara, if you had concerns, the appropriate channel would have been the board. I finished for him. Which is precisely why I'm raising these matters here, in accordance with Section 7.3 of our corporate bylaws. Savannah leaned toward her, Father, whispering something urgently. He shook his head slightly before addressing me again. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Richard. I'm exercising my contractual rights to protect Nexora's interests. I turned to address the full board. The documentation I've provided details several concerning decisions made in recent weeks. The TechVantage platform review that could expose proprietary technology to a direct competitor, the termination of key security personnel during active threat monitoring periods, and the alienation of major clients including Westerland Financial and Mercer Global. Marcus spoke up from the screen. I've reviewed these materials and I find the concerns legitimate and substantial. Richard's expression hardened. This feels like a personal vendetta, Clara. Simply because you're being replaced. This has nothing to do with my position, I interrupted firmly. This is about decisions that threaten the company's stability and competitive advantage. Decisions being made without proper due diligence or understanding of our core business. I turned to Savannah directly. No one questions your intelligence or credentials, Savannah. But Nexora isn't a business school case study. It's a complex organism built over decades through the efforts of hundreds of dedicated people. That can't be understood or reformed in 2 weeks of 15-minute meetings. For the first time, I saw something besides confidence in her eyes. A flicker of uncertainty. The board chair, Eleanor Williams, who had been silently taking notes, finally spoke. These are serious matters that warrant investigation. I propose we form a special committee to review all recent executive decisions and planned restructuring before proceeding further. Philip tried to object, but was overruled when 3 other board members quickly seconded Eleanor's proposal. Furthermore, Eleanor continued, I suggest we temporarily suspend any major organizational changes or strategic shifts until this review is complete. Richard's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table. This is unnecessary and will impede our ability to innovate and adapt. On the contrary, I said quietly, it will ensure that innovation is built on a foundation of understanding rather than assumption. The vote was decisive, 7 in favor, 2 against. As the meeting adjourned 2 hours later, Savannah brushed past me without a word. Richard lingered, his expression unreadable. "You've been planning this all along," he said finally. "No, Richard. I've been hoping it wouldn't be necessary." I gathered my materials calmly. I take no pleasure in today's events. Yet here we are. "Yes," I agreed simply. "Here we are." As I walked out of the boardroom, I felt no triumph, only the weight of responsibility. The confrontation had been necessary, but it was only the beginning. The real work of stabilizing Nexora and charting a sustainable path forward was just starting. Sometimes protection requires confrontation. Sometimes preservation demands disruption. The boardroom battle had been won, but the larger challenge remained, ensuring that what we had built would continue to thrive long after today's drama faded into corporate history. The aftershocks of the boardroom confrontation rippled outward faster than I had anticipated. By Friday morning, whispers of executive conflict had reached beyond Nexora's walls, not through any deliberate leak, but through the inevitable network of relationships that connects any industry. I was reviewing client stability reports in my office when my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Olivia Chen from Ultima Ventures just called me. They've heard rumblings. Might want to prepare a response." This was significant. Ultima Ventures was in final stage discussions about a strategic investment in Nexora, a deal that Savannah had prominently featured in her vision presentations as already secured. The reality, as those of us who had been through funding rounds before knew all too well, was that nothing was secured until the money hit the accounts. I called Marcus immediately. "How much does Olivia know?" I asked without preamble. "Enough to be concerned, not enough to make an informed decision," he replied. "The investor grapevine is buzzing with talk of leadership instability." I considered our options carefully. Transparency might be our best approach here. Not airing dirty laundry, but not pretending everything is business as usual either. Agreed. Want me to set up a call? Please. But I think this should come from both of us. You as founder, me as whatever I am at this point. Marcus chuckled. "Guardian of the Galaxy from what I saw yesterday. I'll arrange it for this afternoon." 3 hours later, we were on a secure video call with Olivia Chen and 2 members of her investment team. After brief pleasantries, Olivia cut straight to the heart of the matter. "We're hearing concerning reports about executive upheaval at Nexora," she said, her expression revealing nothing. "Given the size of our potential commitment, we need clarity on the situation." I took the lead, having prepared carefully for this conversation. "Olivia, I appreciate your directness. There has indeed been some internal discussion about strategic direction, specifically regarding the pace and nature of certain changes being implemented by Richard's daughter," Olivia stated flatly. "It wasn't a question. By our new leadership," I corrected diplomatically. "The board has established a review committee to ensure that all strategic shifts align with Nexora's core strengths and client commitments." "In other words, you're pumping the brakes on whatever she was trying to do," she observed shrewdly. Marcus stepped in. "We're ensuring thoughtful evolution rather than disruptive revolution. Nexora's success has always come from building on our foundation, not replacing it wholesale." Olivia studied us both for a long moment. "Our team spent 3 months doing due diligence on Nexora before proposing this investment. We were impressed by your infrastructure, your client retention rates, and your technical innovation." She paused. "None of those factors included Richard's daughter driving major reorganization." "The fundamentals that impressed you remain intact," I assured her. "In fact, the board's actions yesterday were specifically designed to protect those fundamentals. And Richard? How's he taking this intervention?" Marcus and I exchanged glances. "Professionally," I said finally. "He understands the board's fiduciary responsibilities." Olivia's slight smile suggested she knew this was diplomatic understatement. "Well, we appreciate the transparency. I'll need to discuss this with our full investment committee, of course." After the call ended, Marcus remained on the line. "That went as well as could be expected," he observed. "Perhaps," I agreed. "But investment committees hate uncertainty. We need to stabilize the situation quickly. The special committee meets Monday. That gives Richard and Savannah the weekend to reflect on their approach. Unfortunately, reflection didn't appear to be their immediate priority. By late Friday afternoon, Letitia called with disturbing news. "Savannah just fired Andre," she reported, her voice tight with anger. "Called security to escort him out. His entire team is in shock. Andre, our product development director, 15-year veteran, architect of our core platform. This wasn't just a personnel change. It was a direct attack on institutional knowledge." "On what grounds?" I demanded. "Insubordination and resistance to necessary change, according to the termination notice." I closed my eyes briefly, calculating the implications. Where is he now? At the Grayson, drowning his sorrows. "Clara, this is getting ugly fast. I'll handle it," I promised. "Meanwhile, can you quietly document everything? The sequence of events, witnesses, exact language used." "Already on it." I found Andre at the hotel bar, staring into a barely touched whiskey. His eyes, when he looked up at me, held more bewilderment than anger. 15 years, he said simply. 15 years, and I'm out in 15 minutes. I slid onto the bar stool, beside him. "It's not over yet, Andre. Isn't it?" She had security watching while I packed my desk, Clara. Like I was some kind of threat. "You are a threat to her narrative. You know too much, question too effectively." I signaled the bartender for a soda water. "I need to ask you something important, and I need an honest answer." He straightened slightly. "Always. Are you willing to fight this? Not just for your job, but for what we've built. Because if you are, I have a path forward. But it won't be easy or clean." Andre studied me for a long moment, before a slow smile spread across his face. "You already have a plan, don't you?" "The beginnings of one," I admitted. "But it requires your trust and patience." "You've had both for 15 years, he said simply. "Why stop now?" The following morning, Saturday, I reached out to Eleanor, the board chair. "We need to convene the special committee immediately," I told her. "The situation is escalating in concerning ways." By Monday morning, the special committee had moved up its timeline, convening an emergency session that included virtual testimony from Andre about his termination. What should have been a week-long review process accelerated into a single day of intense examination. Meanwhile, 3 more developments shifted the landscape dramatically. First, Ultima Ventures formally placed their investment discussions on hold pending resolution of management questions. Second, 2 major clients, including Westerland Financial, requested emergency meetings to discuss contract continuity guarantees. Third, and perhaps most damaging, an internal memo from Savannah. To Richard somehow found its way to several board members. The memo outlined plans to eliminate resistance pockets through strategic terminations and suggested exploring alternative arrangements for the company's intellectual property that would effectively circumvent my equity protections. The storm wasn't just spreading, it was intensifying, threatening to transform from internal conflict into existential crisis. By Monday evening, when the special committee delivered its preliminary findings to the full board, the momentum had shifted decisively. What had begun as my solitary stand had evolved into a broader recognition that Nexora stood at a crossroads. The question was no longer whether change would come, but what form that change would take and who would guide it. As I prepared for Tuesday's emergency full board meeting, I knew that whatever happened next would redefine not just my role, but Nexora's future trajectory. The external consequences had become too significant to ignore, too threatening to dismiss as mere growing pains. Sometimes protection requires not just standing your ground, but advancing forward. The time for defensive moves had passed. Now came the moment for resolution. Tuesday's emergency board meeting began at 7:30 a.m., an unusually early start that reflected the gravity of the situation. The boardroom atmosphere was markedly different from our Thursday session. Gone was the procedural formality, replaced by a focused intensity. Richard arrived alone, Savannah noticeably absent. His typically confident demeanor had given way to something more subdued, almost resigned. He nodded briefly to me as he took his seat. Eleanor opened the meeting without preamble. The special committee has completed its preliminary review and reached unanimous conclusions that require immediate board action. She gestured to Victor Zhao, who had chaired the committee. Victor cleared his throat. Our findings indicate a pattern of decisions that collectively represent a material risk to Nexora's operational stability, client relationships, and competitive position. He distributed a summary document to all present. Specifically, we identified 3 areas of critical concern. He proceeded to outline what many of us already knew: the hasty termination of key personnel, alienation of major clients, and exposure of proprietary technology to competitors. Based on these findings, Victor concluded, the committee recommends immediate leadership intervention to stabilize operations and preserve shareholder value. The room fell silent as board members absorbed the implications. Marcus, joining virtually again, was the first to speak. What form of intervention are we considering exactly? Eleanor exchanged glances with Victor before responding. The committee recommends suspending the planned leadership transition and establishing an interim executive structure while we evaluate long-term options. All eyes turned to Richard, whose jaw tightened visibly. This feels like an overreaction to what are essentially growing pains in any transition process, he argued, though his tone lacked conviction. Savannah has made some missteps, certainly, but nothing that warrants this level of intervention. Philip, his longtime ally, nodded in agreement. Perhaps a more measured approach, additional oversight rather than suspension. Eleanor shook her head. The situation has progressed beyond mere oversight concerns. Altima has frozen their investment discussions. Westerlund and Mercer have both indicated they're exploring alternative vendors. 3 senior developers submitted resignations yesterday following Andre's termination. And speaking of that termination, Victor added, our legal team has identified significant procedural violations that expose us to potential wrongful termination liability. Richard's shoulders sagged slightly. What exactly are you proposing? A 3-part motion, Eleanor replied. First, immediate suspension of the leadership transition. Second, temporary reinstatement of Clara to oversee stabilization of client relationships and operations. Third, formation of a search committee to identify appropriate long-term leadership candidates, with the explicit understanding that all qualified individuals will be considered, including Savannah, if she demonstrates the necessary understanding of our business fundamentals. I remained quiet throughout this exchange, watching the dynamic shift as board members processed the proposal. This wasn't about me versus Savannah anymore. It had evolved into a question of corporate survival versus unchecked disruption. The vote, when it came, was decisive. 8 in favor, 1 abstention, Richard himself, 0 against. As the meeting concluded, Richard approached me in the hallway outside. For a moment, we simply stood there, 2 people who had worked toward the same goals from vastly different perspectives. This isn't how I envisioned things unfolding, he said finally. Nor I admitted. For what it's worth, I take no pleasure in this outcome. He studied me with tired eyes. What happens now? Healing, I said simply. Rebuilding trust with our clients, our team, our investors. Not erasing the past few weeks, but learning from them. And Savannah? I chose my words carefully. That depends on her. There's a place for fresh perspective at Nexora, always has been, but it needs to be built on understanding, not demolition. Richard nodded slowly. I'll speak with her. He turned to leave, then paused. You know, Marcus always said you were the heart of this company. I think I'm finally understanding what he meant. The work of rebuilding began immediately. My first act was to call Andre and offer him not just reinstatement, but a promotion to Chief Product Officer, a role that better reflected his contributions and expertise. His response was immediate and affirmative. I never wanted to leave, he told me. I just couldn't stand watching everything we built being dismantled by someone who didn't understand its value. Next came the client reassurance campaign. Letitia and I personally visited our top 5 clients, bringing technical teams to demonstrate our continued commitment to their unique needs. Westerlund Financial, initially the most alarmed, became our strongest advocate after we unveiled a security enhancement specifically designed for their regulatory environment, a project that had been quietly developing in R&D for months before being sidelined in Savannah's reorganization. The Altima Ventures situation required more finesse. Rather than pushing for an immediate restoration of investment talks, I invited Olivia Chen to spend a full day at Nexora, meeting with teams across all departments, reviewing our technology roadmap, and observing our operations firsthand. No presentations, no sales pitch, I told her. Just see who we are and what we do, then decide if we're still the company you want to invest in. By day's end, she was sending texts to her investment committee. 3 days later, they not only reactivated discussions, but increased their proposed investment by 15%. What convinced you? I asked her over dinner that evening. Authenticity, she replied without hesitation. Every person I met cared deeply about what they were building. That's rare, and it's valuable. The internal healing took longer. Trust, once fractured, requires patient reconstruction. I instituted weekly all-hands meetings where nothing was off-limits for discussion. We acknowledged mistakes, including my own in perhaps not being more direct earlier in the process, and celebrated small victories as they accumulated. 2 months into the stabilization process, a surprise arrived in my inbox, an email from Savannah Kessler. I wonder if you might have time for coffee, she wrote. There are some things I believe we should discuss, professional to professional. We met at a quiet cafe far from the office. The Savannah who greeted me bore little resemblance to the confident, almost arrogant young executive from our first lunch. This version was more measured, more thoughtful. I owe you an apology, she began without preamble. I approached Nexora with assumptions rather than questions, and that was deeply misguided. I nodded, waiting for her to continue. After everything happened, she went on, I spent some time consulting with a boutique analytics firm in Boston. It was humbling, to say the least. I realized how much I didn't understand about enterprise architecture, about client relationship development, about the human infrastructure that makes technology valuable. That's a valuable revelation, I observed. Many executives never reach it. She smiled ruefully. My father says you offered a path for me to potentially return to Nexora someday. If that's what you want, I confirmed. Though perhaps in a role better aligned with your actual strengths rather than an arbitrary position. I've been thinking about that, she admitted. My background in market strategy might be useful in expanding Nexora's presence in emerging markets, starting from a position of learning rather than dictating. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours as we explored possibilities, boundaries, and mutual expectations. By the time we parted, a tentative blueprint had formed, not for her immediate return, but for a structured path that would begin with her actually understanding our business from the ground up. 3 more months passed. The special board committee transitioned into a permanent governance improvement initiative. Client confidence returned, along with renewed growth. Andre's promotion to CPO unlocked innovation that had been simmering untapped for years. And me? I found myself at another crossroads. We need you as CEO, Eleanor told me during a private lunch. The board is unanimous on this point. I shook my head. That's not the right path forward. Why not? You've essentially been functioning in that capacity already. Because Nexora needs to evolve beyond its founders and original team, I explained. My role should be to ensure that evolution happens thoughtfully, not to prevent it entirely. What emerged instead was a more nuanced arrangement. I stepped into a newly created role as Chief Strategy Advisor, with a seat on the board and specific oversight of major directional shifts. We conducted a proper executive search and found Eliza Montgomery, a brilliant leader with both technical depth and genuine emotional intelligence, qualities that complement each other far more often than the tech world acknowledges. 6 months. After the boardroom confrontation, I began transitioning to a part-time advisory role, splitting my time between the Nexora offices and my home in the countryside, 30 miles from the city's perpetual hum. On my last day as a full-time executive, the team organized a low-key gathering. No formal speeches, just genuine conversation and connection. As I prepared to leave, Andre walked me to my car. "You know what I realized today?" he said. "You've always been playing the long game, haven't you? Even back when we were working out of Marcus's garage, you were thinking about what Nexora could become, not just what it was." I smiled. The best things take time to build properly. Companies, careers, trust, none of them respond well to shortcuts. "Will you really stay connected?" he asked. "Or is this one of those advisory roles that fades away?" "I'll be here," I promised. Not hovering, not controlling, but present when needed. Some responsibilities don't end with a title change. As I drove home that evening, watching the city skyline recede in my rearview mirror, I reflected on the journey. From first employee to guardian, from builder to preserver, each role had required different skills, different approaches, different forms of courage. What remained constant was the understanding that true value isn't built in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but in the patient, persistent commitment to doing things right, even when, perhaps especially when, no one is watching or applauding. My phone buzzed with a text from Eliza. "First week done. Questions when you have time." I smiled. The story continued, evolving in ways I could guide but not control. And that, perhaps, was the greatest success of all, creating something strong enough to outlast any single person's vision or tenure. The countryside home came into view as I rounded. The final bend, peaceful, solid, welcoming, much like the legacy I hoped to leave. Not one of domination or indispensability, but of thoughtful foundation building that enables others to build higher still. Sometimes the most powerful impact isn't in claiming the spotlight, but in strengthening the stage so that future performances can shine even brighter. In stepping back without stepping away, I had found not an ending, but a different kind of beginning. The transition to my advisory role unfolded more naturally than I had anticipated. 3 days a week, I worked remotely from my countryside home, with video calls and collaborative documents bridging the physical distance. 2 days, I made the drive into the city, timing my arrivals to avoid rush hour traffic, one of many small freedoms my new arrangement afforded. On those in-office days, I observed Eliza Montgomery settling into her leadership with impressive grace. Unlike Savannah's approach of immediate disruption, Eliza spent her first month primarily listening, scheduling one-on-ones with team leaders, sitting in on client calls as an observer, and absorbing the complex ecosystem that was Nexora, before proposing significant changes. She asked about the Simpson account implementation challenges for nearly an hour yesterday, Andre reported during one of our weekly catch-up coffees. Not just surface questions, she wanted to understand the technical architecture limitations and how they intersect with the client's regulatory environment. "And your impression?" I asked, though I could already read the answer in his relaxed posture. "She gets it," he said simply. "The complexity, the nuance, the history. But she's not paralyzed by it either. She's already identified 3 potential approaches that none of us had considered. This pattern repeated across departments. Eliza, bringing fresh perspective without dismissing institutional knowledge, challenging assumptions while respecting foundations. The balance I had hoped for but wasn't certain we would find. One Tuesday afternoon, about 4 months into this new chapter, Eliza asked me to join her for lunch in her office. "I want to run something by you," she said, after we settled with our salads. "Something significant." I nodded for her to continue. Aventine Tech has approached us about potential acquisition. The numbers are substantial. She slid a folder across the desk. The figure on the term sheet made me blink twice. "That's certainly attention-getting." "It is," she agreed. "And there are compelling strategic advantages. Their international presence, complementary product suite, combined client base." She paused. "But I'm hesitant." "Why?" "Because acquisitions of this nature often look promising on paper, but destroy the very qualities that made the acquired company valuable in the first place." She leaned forward slightly. "I've been on both sides of these transactions. The promises of autonomy and cultural preservation rarely survive the first post-acquisition quarter." I studied her thoughtfully. "Most CEOs in your position would be pushing hard for this. The exit package alone would be life-changing." She met my gaze directly. "I didn't come to Nexora for an exit package. I came because I believed in what you've built and where it could go next." Her expression turned questioning. "Am I missing something? Should we be pursuing this more aggressively?" In that moment, I realized that Eliza wasn't just a capable executive. She was a genuine steward, someone who saw beyond immediate gains to longer horizons. The very quality I had hoped to find but didn't dare expect. "No," I said finally. "Your instincts are sound. Nexora's strength has always been our independence, our ability to evolve based on client needs rather than corporate mandates or quarterly earnings pressures." She nodded, visibly relieved. "Then I'll politely decline their invitation to further discussions. Or," I suggested, "counter with a strategic partnership proposal instead. There are ways to capture the benefits without surrendering our identity." This became our pattern. Eliza bringing challenging questions, me offering context and perspective, and together finding paths that honored both innovation and continuity. Meanwhile, Savannah Kessler's journey took an unexpected turn. True to Datitatin, our coffee shop discussion, she had begun a structured learning process about Nexora's business fundamentals. What no one anticipated was how thoroughly she would embrace this education. "She's requested a 3-month rotation in the client implementation team," Eliza informed me during one of our strategy sessions. "Says she wants to understand the practical challenges of platform customization from the ground up." I couldn't hide my surprise. "That's not what I expected." "Me neither." But her direct supervisor says she's approaching it with genuine curiosity. No shortcuts, no special treatment. This new Savannah, humbled but determined, gradually earned respect not through her last name, but through demonstrated commitment. 6 months into her education, she presented a thoughtful analysis of inefficiencies in our onboarding process that saved new clients an average of 12 days in implementation time. Richard observed this transformation with quiet pride. During a board dinner, he pulled me aside briefly. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For not writing her off. For seeing the possibility of growth rather than just the reality of mistake." I smiled. Sometimes the best teachers are our own missteps, if we're willing to learn from them. As my first year in the advisory role drew to a close, a new rhythm had established itself. Nexora was thriving under Eliza's leadership, growing thoughtfully rather than frantically. The board had stabilized, with governance processes that emphasized strategic foresight rather than reactive management. My countryside home had become not just a retreat, but a different kind of workplace. I had converted the sunroom into an office with views of rolling hills and distant mountains, a perspective that seemed to naturally encourage longer-term thinking. Increasingly, I found team members reaching out not just for official guidance, but for informal mentorship. Young analysts, mid-career managers, even senior directors sought conversations about career paths, leadership challenges, and work-life integration. Letitia, now our chief client officer, drove out one Friday afternoon for what had become our monthly strategy walk through nearby trails. "You know what they call you now?" she asked, as we crested a hill overlooking a valley painted in autumn colors. "I'm almost afraid to ask." She smiled. "The Oracle. Not in a mystic way, but because people say you help them see around corners, anticipate challenges before they become crises." I laughed. "That makes me sound ancient and all-knowing." "Well, the ancient part might be debatable," she teased, "but the wisdom part isn't. You've always had that ability to see patterns others miss, to connect dots across different timelines." "It's just experience," I demurred. "Anyone who's weathered enough storms develops a sense for changing barometric pressure." "Maybe," she allowed. "But not everyone chooses to share that knowledge. Not everyone creates space for others to develop their own wisdom." Her observation stayed with me long after she'd left. Perhaps that was the most valuable legacy one could leave. Not just the buildings constructed or revenues generated, but the capacity for thoughtful action instilled in others. As twilight settled over the countryside that evening, I sat on my porch watching the day's light fade into gentle darkness. My phone buzzed with a message from Andre. "Implementation team just solved the Westerlund encryption challenge. Using your approach from 2012, with Savannah's modifications, thought you'd appreciate the synchronicity." I smiled at the beautiful symmetry. Ideas flowing across time, across generations of leadership, improved, refined, but recognizable in their core essence. This was what sustainable growth looked like. Not erasing what came before, not blindly preserving it either, but building upon foundations with respect and innovation simultaneously. The company I had helped nurture from infancy was now fully mature, capable of evolving without losing its essential nature. My role had changed profoundly over these decades, from builder to leader to guardian to guide. Each phase had required different strengths, different approaches, yet the through line remained constant, a commitment to creating something of lasting value, something that improved lives both within our walls and beyond them. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, I felt a profound sense of contentment. Not the contentment of completion, for no meaningful work is ever truly finished, but the contentment of right relationship, of knowing that my contribution mattered not because it was indispensable, but because it was authentic and freely given. The countryside night wrapped around me like a familiar blanket. In the distance, city lights marked where Nexora's offices stood, still humming with activity even at this hour, still evolving in ways I could influence but no longer needed to control. This too was wisdom, knowing when to hold tightly and when to open your hands, allowing what you've nurtured to find its own path forward, not an ending, but a continuation, a story extending beyond any single chapter, character, or narrator. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new opportunities for growth, and I would meet them not as the indispensable center, but as a thoughtful contributor to something larger than myself, exactly where I was meant to be. Because sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't what you keep close, but what you set free to thrive in your absence. The quiet strength not of domination, but of influenced evolution. The subtle power not of control, but of enduring positive impact.